Marcus Langston glanced absent-mindedly out the window of his luxury car as it glided down the bustling city street. It was just another day, another meeting, another deal to close. The world outside was a blur of faces, none of them important, none of them memorable. Until he saw them. 4 children, standing on the street corner, laughing and playing. They were dressed in worn-out clothes, their shoes scuffed and dirty. Yet, they radiated an innocent joy that made them seem almost out of place in the busy, indifferent city. But it wasn't their laughter or their ragged appearance that caught Marcus's attention. It was their faces. His heart skipped a beat. His mouth went dry. They looked exactly like him. Same piercing green eyes. Same dark hair curling around their foreheads. Same sharp jawlines. It was as if he were staring at childhood photographs of himself, come to life and multiplied by 4. One of the boys, the tallest of the group, looked up and his eyes locked with Marcus's. His playful smile faded, replaced by an expression of shock. He took a step back, his hand gripping his younger brother's arm. The others followed his gaze, their eyes widening as they stared at the man in the car. Marcus felt his chest tighten, a cold shiver running down his spine. Who were these children? Why did they look exactly like him? And why were they staring at him as if they had seen a ghost? Before he could process what was happening, the tallest boy's lips moved. One word, a whisper that Marcus couldn't hear but somehow understood. Dad? The air seemed to freeze. Marcus's body went rigid, his mind reeling. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The children's faces went pale, their eyes filled with fear and confusion. Then, as if controlled by a single thought, they turned and bolted down a narrow alley, disappearing from sight. Stop the car! Marcus's voice came out hoarse, shaking. The driver looked at him through the rearview mirror, eyes wide with concern. Sir? Stop the car! Now! The tires screeched as the car came to a halt. Marcus threw the door open and stumbled out, his heart racing, his mind spinning. He ran to the corner where the children had been, his eyes searching frantically. Nothing. They were gone. The alley was empty, silent, as if they had never been there at all. He stood there, panting, confusion and fear swirling inside him. Who were those children? Why did they look exactly like him? And why did they call him Dad? Marcus's hands trembled as he pulled out his phone. He didn't know who to call, what to say, or how to make sense of what he had just seen. But one thing was certain, he needed answers. And he wouldn't rest until he found them. Marcus Langston had everything money could buy. He was the embodiment of power and wealth, a billionaire who controlled empires with the flick of his wrist. Skyscrapers bore his name, and his influence stretched across continents. To the world, he was a man who had conquered it all. But behind the glossy facade, Marcus was utterly alone. His mansion was a sprawling fortress, filled with priceless art and state-of-the-art technology, yet hollow and lifeless. No laughter echoed in its halls, no warmth lingered in its rooms. He had no wife, no children, no family to share his riches with. To Marcus, emotions were weaknesses, and attachments were liabilities. The only thing that mattered was power. And money was power. His routine was mechanical, calculated to perfection. He woke up at precisely 5:30 a.m., his mornings filled with workouts that sculpted his body into a symbol of discipline and control. By 7 a.m., he was dressed in a tailored suit that cost more than most people earned in a year. He would sit down to a meticulously prepared breakfast, served by a staff who never dared to meet his eyes. He didn't bother learning their names, they were merely tools, like the phones and tablets that buzzed with news of his growing wealth. Marcus had no patience for inefficiency. He demanded perfection from his employees and discarded anyone who failed to meet his standards. His reputation as a ruthless businessman was legendary, feared in boardrooms worldwide. Competitors crumbled under his calculated strategies, and allies dared not cross him. To Marcus, the world was a chessboard, and he was the grandmaster, moving pieces without emotion, without mercy. Yet, beneath the cold exterior, a faint shadow of regret lurked. A memory he tried to forget, a face he tried to erase. Years ago, he ended a relationship without a second thought. She was just another chapter in his life, a beautiful, gentle woman who loved him with all her heart. But Marcus didn't believe in love. He believed in power. She begged him to stay, tears streaming down her face, her voice trembling as she confessed, "I need you, we need you." But he walked away without looking back, never bothering to call, never caring to find out what happened to her. His secretary's voice snapped him back to the present. "Mr. Langston, the board is ready for your presentation." Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment, pushing away the memory, burying it deep within his heart where no one could reach. He adjusted his tie and stood up, his posture rigid and commanding. "Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes." He walked to the window of his high-rise office, overlooking the city that bowed to his will. Skyscrapers stretched into the sky, monuments to his ambition. Yet, even from this height, he couldn't escape the hollow emptiness that gnawed at his soul. A knock on the door broke his reverie. "Sir, your car is waiting." Marcus turned, his face an emotionless mask. "Let's go." As he descended the elevator, his phone buzzed with messages of success, profits soaring, competitors crushed. But for the first time, he found himself staring at his reflection in the elevator's mirrored walls. He saw his own eyes, cold and distant, and for a fleeting second, they looked strangely empty. He quickly looked away, straightening his shoulders as the doors opened to a crowd of cameras and reporters. They shouted his name, hungry for a glimpse of the man who controlled the world. He smiled for the cameras, a flawless, practiced smile that hid the void within. "Mr. Langston, any comments on the latest merger? What's your next big move, Mr. Langston?" His answers were precise, rehearsed, calculated. They always were. But as he stepped into his car, he glanced once more at the city passing by, the faces of strangers, people living lives he could never understand. He dismissed the thought, focusing on the day's agenda. Power. Wealth. Control. That was all that mattered. Or at least, that's what he wanted to believe. He didn't know that his world was about to be shattered. That the past he thought he had buried would come rushing back. And it would come in the form of 4 children who bore his face. Marcus Langston couldn't get the faces of those children out of his mind. He spent the entire night staring at his ceiling, haunted by the identical eyes that mirrored his own. Those boys, they looked exactly like him. It was impossible, yet he had seen it with his own eyes. Their faces were burned into his memory, the same sharp jawline, the same intense gaze, even the same nervous smile. But who were they? And how could they possibly be connected to him? The questions gnawed at him, refusing to let him rest. By morning, he was a man possessed, driven by a need for answers. He canceled his meetings, ignored calls from his business partners, and focused solely on solving the mystery. Standing in front of his floor-to-ceiling window, Marcus watched the city hum with life below him. Somewhere out there were 4 children who bore his face. And he was going to find them. He called his most trusted private investigator, Cole Matthews, a man known for his discretion and effectiveness. Within an hour, Cole stood in Marcus's office, his expression professional but curious. "You've never asked me to track down kids before," Cole remarked, raising an eyebrow. Marcus's jaw tightened. "They're not just kids. They look exactly like me." Cole's eyes widened, but his training took over. "Do you have any leads?" Marcus handed him a photograph he had taken with his phone, zoomed in just before the children ran away. The image was grainy but clear enough to see their faces, his faces. Cole's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll find them." Within hours, Cole sent a report. The children were orphans, living on the streets, surviving by their wits. Locals called them the Ghost Brothers because they moved like shadows, never staying in one place for too long. No one knew where they came from or who their parents were. Marcus's chest tightened. Orphans. How could they be orphans? He never had children, or at least, he didn't think he did. The thought made his stomach churn. He went back to the alley where he first saw them, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. He questioned shop owners, street vendors, even beggars, but no one knew much. The children were ghosts, slipping through the cracks of society. Then, a breakthrough. An old man sitting on a bench remembered them. "Those boys," the man wheezed, his voice raspy with age. "They're always together. Protect each other like wolves. Saw them near the abandoned factory a few days ago." Marcus's heart raced. He went to the factory, a crumbling building long forgotten by the city. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the floor covered in broken glass and debris. But there were signs of life, old blankets, empty cans, scribbles on the walls. They had been here. Recently. He walked through the ruins, his footsteps echoing. He felt a strange pull in his chest, an ache he didn't understand. They were his blood. He was certain of it now. But why were they abandoned? Why were they living in such misery? A noise broke his thoughts. He spun around to see a figure standing in the shadows, a boy, the tallest one, his eyes wide with fear. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. The boy looked exactly like him. Before Marcus could speak, the boy turned and bolted, his footsteps echoing through the empty factory. "Wait!" Marcus shouted, running after him. His expensive shoes slipped on the debris, his breaths ragged. He hadn't run like this in years, but he didn't care. He had to catch him. The boy was fast, darting through the ruins like a shadow. But Marcus was driven by a desperation he couldn't explain. He followed the boy through a maze of corridors, his heart thundering. Then, suddenly, the boy was gone. Marcus stood alone, panting, his eyes darting around the empty room. He felt a crushing sense of loss, a hollow ache in his chest. He had been so close. He sank to his knees, the weight of the mystery pressing down on him. Who were these children? Why did they look exactly like him? And why were they so afraid? He didn't have the answers. Not yet. But he swore he would find them. No matter what it took. Marcus Langston couldn't escape the truth any longer. The faces of those children haunted him, their piercing green eyes identical to his own. The more he investigated, the more the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. And every piece pointed to one undeniable fact: those boys were his sons. But how? When? He had never married, never had children, or so he thought. The only possibility, the only woman he had ever been close to, was Elena Monroe. A name he hadn't allowed himself to think about for years. They had met over a decade ago, when Marcus was just beginning to build his empire. Elena was warm, gentle, and full of dreams. She loved him with all her heart, and for a moment, Marcus had allowed himself to feel the same. But ambition consumed him, and love was a distraction he couldn't afford. So he ended it. Coldly. Without explanation. Without a backward glance. He remembered her last words, her voice trembling, eyes filled with tears. "I need you, we need you." He thought she was just being dramatic, trying to make him stay. He never considered she might have been telling the truth. Marcus stood outside the small, run-down apartment building, his chest tightening with each step he took. The paint was peeling, the stairs creaked under his weight. He could hardly believe Elena had ended up here, in a place so far removed from the luxury he took for granted. His heart pounded as he knocked on the door. There was a rustling sound from inside, then the door opened, revealing a woman who looked like a shadow of the vibrant Elena he once knew. Her hair was dull, her face pale and tired, but her eyes were the same. They widened in shock. "Marcus?" He struggled to find his voice. "Elena, we need to talk." She let him in, her movements stiff and guarded. The apartment was small and cold, sparsely furnished. There were signs of children everywhere, old toys, scattered crayons, drawings taped to the walls. Drawings of 4 boys, identical to him. Marcus's chest tightened. "Those children, they're mine, aren't they?" Elena's face went pale. She looked away, her shoulders trembling. "I tried to tell you, all those years ago. But you didn't listen. You walked away." His heart sank. He remembered her pleading, her voice breaking. He had ignored her, choosing ambition over love. "I didn't know. I didn't understand." "No." Elena's voice was cold, anger flashing in her eyes. "You didn't care." Her words were like knives, cutting deep. Marcus felt his legs weaken, and he sank onto a worn-out chair. "Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Elena's lips trembled. "I did. But you were too busy building your empire, too busy to care about anything but yourself. I knew you wouldn't want them. So I raised them on my own." She paused, her eyes hardening. "But I couldn't give them the life they deserved. And now I'm dying, Marcus. That's why they're on the streets. Because I wasn't strong enough to stay." Marcus felt the room spin around him. He looked at Elena, really looked at her, and saw the shadows under her eyes, the frailness of her body. She was sick, dying. And his sons were alone, abandoned, living like ghosts because he had been too blind, too arrogant to see the truth. Tears burned his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. "I'll take them in. I'll give them everything they need." "No." Elena's voice was sharp, filled with pain. "You can't just buy their love, Marcus. They don't even know you. They think you're just a rich man who doesn't care." Her words struck him like a blow. She was right. Money couldn't fix this. He had broken something precious, something fragile, and he had no idea how to make it whole again. "I don't know how to be a father," he whispered, his voice cracking. Elena looked at him, her eyes softening. "You start by being there. By showing them you care. Not with money, but with time, with love." Marcus looked at the drawings on the wall, images of 4 boys who were his flesh and blood. Boys who had grown up without him, who had suffered because of his choices. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling. "I'm not leaving this time, Elena. I'm staying, for them." Her lips quivered, tears filling her eyes. "Then you better start by finding them, before it's too late." Marcus stood, his heart heavy but determined. He had a second chance, a chance to do what was right. And he wouldn't waste it. Not this time. Marcus Langston had never felt so lost. He stood outside the crumbling factory where his children had been hiding, his heart pounding as he clutched a bag of groceries in one hand and a bundle of blankets in the other. He was terrified. Not of the cold wind biting at his face or the shadows lurking in the ruins, but of the 4 pairs of eyes that would be waiting for him inside. 4 pairs of eyes that mirrored his own. For boys who were his blood but saw him as a stranger, or worse, an enemy. The first time he tried to approach them, they ran away. The second time, they yelled at him to leave, throwing rocks and insults. "We don't need your charity," the eldest had shouted, his eyes blazing with anger. "You weren't there when we needed you." Those words cut deeper than any wound Marcus had ever known. But he didn't give up. He kept coming back, day after day, standing at a distance to watch over them, bringing food, water, and blankets when the nights grew colder. He learned their names: Ethan, Leo, Noah, and Lucas. His sons. His boys. He watched them from the shadows, his heart aching as they huddled together for warmth, laughing and teasing each other, fierce in their loyalty and love. They were brothers in every sense of the word, bonded by hardship, by survival. And he had been absent from their lives, absent when they needed him the most. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Marcus approached the factory once more. He found them crouched around a small fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. The youngest, Lucas, was coughing, his small body shivering despite his brother's attempts to keep him warm. Marcus's chest tightened. He couldn't stand by and watch any longer. He stepped into the light, his shadow stretching across the floor. The boy's head snapped up, eyes wide with fear and anger. Ethan, the eldest, jumped to his feet, fists clenched. "What do you want? Why can't you just leave us alone?" Marcus's throat tightened. "I came to help." He took a step closer, setting the groceries and blankets on the floor. "Lucas is sick. He needs medicine, and I want to help him. Please." For a moment, there was only silence. Then Ethan's face twisted in anger. "Why now? Where were you when Mom was dying? Where were you when we were hungry, when we had nothing?" His voice broke, his shoulders shaking. "You were off in your mansion, living like a king while we were suffering." Tears burned in Marcus's eyes. "I didn't know. I didn't know about you, about any of this. And I'm so sorry. I can't change the past, but I want to make it right. I want to be there for you, if you'll let me." Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes red and shining. "We don't need your money. We're fine on our own." Marcus nodded, his chest aching. "I know. But maybe you need a father." Silence fell over the room, heavy and suffocating. Lucas's coughing broke the tension, his small body shaking with each gasp. Marcus's heart shattered. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Let me take him to a doctor. Let me help." Ethan looked down at his youngest brother, his face torn with worry. Finally, he nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Fine, but just this once." Marcus's shoulders sagged with relief. He approached Lucas slowly, his movements gentle, careful not to scare him. The boy looked up at him with wide, fearful eyes, and Marcus's heart ached with guilt and love. He lifted Lucas into his arms, feeling the boy's frail body trembling against his chest. For the first time, he felt like a father. He took Lucas to the hospital, staying by his side all night, watching him sleep, his little face so peaceful and innocent. As the sun rose, the other brothers arrived, standing hesitantly at the door. Marcus looked up, his heart swelling as they entered, their eyes wary but curious. He stood up, giving them space. I'll wait outside. Take your time. Ethan's voice stopped him. You can stay. For now. It was just 3 words. But it was more than Marcus could have hoped for. He sat back down, his heart pounding, his hands trembling. He was still a stranger to them, still an outsider. But he was here. And for the first time, he wasn't alone. Marcus Langston stood before his family's estate, a sprawling mansion that loomed over the city like a monument to power and privilege. The walls were made of stone, cold and impenetrable, just like the hearts of the people who lived inside. His parents were waiting for him, their faces stern, their eyes calculating. They had heard the rumors, the whispers that Marcus had acknowledged 4 children as his own, children who had been living on the streets. Is it true? His father demanded, his voice cold and hard. You've claimed those urchins as your blood? Marcus's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. They are my sons. His mother's face twisted in disgust. They are illegitimate. Filthy. They don't belong in this family. They belong with me, Marcus shot back, his voice trembling with anger. And if they don't belong in this family, then neither do I. His father's eyes narrowed. Do you have any idea what this will do to our name? To our legacy? Our business partners will question your judgment. Our investors will see you as weak. Marcus met his father's gaze, his voice steady. Let them. The room fell silent. His parents stared at him as if seeing him for the first time. His father's face hardened. If you bring them into this family, you'll be disowned. Stripped of your inheritance. Everything you've built will be taken away. Are you prepared to sacrifice all of it for a handful of street rats? Marcus's heart pounded. He looked at the opulence around him, the paintings, the crystal chandeliers, the wealth that had been his birthright. It was everything he had ever known. Everything he had once cared about. But not anymore. He saw their faces in his mind, Ethan, standing tall and strong, trying to protect his brothers. Leo, with his fierce temper but soft heart. Noah, the quiet one who observed everything with those sharp, curious eyes. And Lucas, the youngest, the most vulnerable, who had clung to him in the hospital, whispering, "Are you really my dad?" They were his sons. His blood. His responsibility. And he would do whatever it took to keep them safe. Marcus straightened his shoulders, his jaw set. Yes. I'm prepared to give up everything, for them. His father's face turned red with fury. Then get out. You are no longer my son. Marcus felt a pain sharper than any blade. But he didn't falter. Goodbye, Father. He turned and walked out of the mansion, out of the life he had known, out of the shadow of a family that had never loved him. And he didn't look back. He returned to the abandoned factory, his heart heavy but resolute. He found his sons huddled together, their faces pale and fearful. Ethan stood protectively in front of his brothers, his chin raised defiantly. You came back, he said, his voice shaking. Why? Marcus sank to his knees before them, his eyes filled with tears. Because I love you. Because I'm your father, and I'm here to stay. Ethan's face crumpled, his walls breaking down. He took a step forward, his lips trembling. We thought you didn't want us. That we were just mistakes. Marcus's heart shattered. He reached out, his voice breaking. You are my sons. You are not mistakes. You are the greatest gift I've ever been given. One by one, the boys stepped forward, their faces wet with tears. They fell into his arms, their small bodies shaking with sobs. Marcus held them tightly, his own tears falling freely. He felt their warmth, their hearts beating against his chest. His sons. His family. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry for everything. But I'm here now. And I'm never leaving again." Ethan's arms tightened around him, his voice muffled by Marcus's shoulder. "Promise?" Marcus closed his eyes, his heart bursting with love. "I promise. No matter what, I'll always be here for you." They stayed like that for a long time, tangled together, father and sons, broken pieces finally fitting together. When they pulled apart, Marcus looked at his boys, his eyes filled with pride and love. "Let's go home." Ethan frowned. "We don't have a home." Marcus smiled, his heart light for the first time in years. "Yes, we do. We'll build one. Together." He took their hands, leading them out of the shadows and into the light. Together, they walked away from the past, towards a future filled with hope, love, and second chances. A future they would build as a family. Marcus Langston stood in the garden of his new home, watching his sons chase each other through the tall grass, their laughter ringing out like music. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the scene, bathing everything in warmth and light. For the first time in his life, Marcus felt truly at peace. He had given up everything, his wealth, his power, his name. But in losing it all, he had gained something far more precious. He had gained a family. His heart swelled as he watched Ethan try to catch Leo, both of them tumbling to the ground in a heap of laughter. Noah was perched in a tree, his sharp eyes observing everything, a quiet smile on his face. And Lucas, the youngest, ran to Marcus, his tiny arms wrapping around his leg as he looked up with eyes full of love and trust. "Dad, are you happy?" Lucas asked, his voice innocent and pure. Marcus's throat tightened. He knelt down, pulling Lucas into his arms. "Yes, buddy. I'm the happiest man in the world." He looked over at his sons, his heart bursting with pride. They were his legacy, his reason to live. Not the skyscrapers or the wealth he once worshipped, but these 4 boys who had taught him what it meant to love, to sacrifice, to be human. He had lost his fortune, his status, his empire. But in return, he had found his soul. A tear slipped down his cheek, but this time, it wasn't from pain or regret. It was from joy, pure, untainted joy. He had made mistakes, terrible mistakes. But he had been given a second chance. And this time, he wouldn't waste it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus gathered his sons around him, his arms wrapping protectively around them. "Come on, boys. Let's go inside. It's getting late." They followed him without question, their laughter echoing through the garden, filling the once empty house with life and love. He had left behind his past, his greed, his ambition. He had chosen his sons over wealth, over power. And he had never been richer. Powerful takeaway. Money can buy comfort, but it can't buy forgiveness or love. Sometimes, the greatest riches are the people who stand beside you, no matter what. Marcus had learned this lesson the hard way. But he had learned it, and it had changed his life forever. As the camera zooms out, capturing the silhouette of a father and his 4 sons standing together against the fading light, a voiceover asks, "What would you choose? Wealth and power? Or love and family? What would you do if you found out you had children you never knew about? Could you give up everything for them? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more heartwarming stories with powerful twists. Until next time, remember, true wealth isn't measured by money, but by love. The screen fades to black, the echoes of laughter lingering as the credits roll.